Okay. My name's Peter Smallage. I'm the New York State Extension Forester and based here in Ithaca, New York. And I run the Forest Connect program, which includes, among other things, a monthly webinar series where we bring in fabulous speakers such as we have this evening. Dr. Nyland has joined us on several prior webinars and is always a sure bet to get a great turnout and a great conversation. So a great conversation based on a great presentation. So tonight's no different. Dr. Nyland's going to be presenting the inverse illusion, a two-sided story. So with that, Ralph, I'm going to mute my microphone and turn the screen over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Sounds good. Good evening, everyone. Today in Syracuse started out with sunshine and brightness, and by the end of the afternoon it was bleak and overcast and chilly. So the morning was an allusion to the afternoon and did not portend what lies ahead in the days. But we want to talk about illusions today and a variety of illusions. There we go. Let's consider some things we already know. We tend to forget. Actually, we probably tend to ignore them more than we forget them, but it may be convenient, so we just ignore what we know. But also remember that what's new to us, someone likely thought about in the past. I've tripped over that many times in my career, thinking I had a great idea, only to realize that someone else got there. So let's explore some old and some new and see where it gets us. And first start with some old philosophy, an understanding about silviculture, my interpretation of silviculture. To me, it's a serious business because it has long-term consequences. It's the process whereby we create residual stands. Silviculture is not the process of taking out products. It's a process of creating residual stands that will grow and develop into the future in predictable ways and provide to the values continuously, sustainably into the future. So it's the way we sustain essential conditions, both the ecological ones and the economic outcomes, to serve a landowner's long-term interest. And as economic, I don't just mean commodity, but I mean the institutional, social values are important to the land, as well as the commodities that help us to pay bills and do the operation. So silviculture, we treat the present to create and sustain a predictable future of the kind that best serves the landowner's interest, consistent with the conditions within the stand and the environment. So, silviculture, we tend in mature age classes, or we regenerate mature land. Those two things. And we leave a lasting footprint in the forest, a footprint that will persist for decades into the years ahead. So let's get it right each time. Let's make sure that the footprint we leave has promise for the future, as well as satisfies the interests of the landowner in the present. Well, what about illusions? Look at these diagrams. These are graphic stand tables representing the numbers of trees by diameter class. Are they for uneven age stands? Even age stands? Well, David Marcus, back in the 80s, published those diagrams as three different structural types that he found in even age communities. Isn't that interesting? So this one is the classic bell-shaped type of distribution we all learned about as students. It applies to stands of very low shade-tolerant species, where the overtopped and the intermediate trees died at an early age. So communities of white ash, of black cherry, of red pine, of aspen, shade-intolerant species will have this bell-shaped type of distribution. Old even age stands of other communities may have it too, but they're really old stands. This kind of classic reverse J distribution you find in species with high shade tolerance, where many of the overtopped and the lower intermediate trees live on for long periods of time, well into the mid-rotation ages. So sugar maple dominated stands would have that kind of a diameter distribution. for small, medium, and large size trees, and so would other shade-tolerant species like red spruce. And then you get this funny shape. It's a left-hand tail on the potbelly. The left-hand tail is for the slower-growing shade-tolerant species, and the right-hand potbelly for the faster-growing shade-intolerant species. So here in New York, we would get mixtures of white ash, black cherry, and sugar maple, where the diameter distribution forms this tail and potbelly kind of shape. But you also find that in 2-age stands and some irregular, uneven age ones that aren't balanced, that had some sort of a strange management history. So in the 2-age stands like this one, it's an overstory of widely spaced sugar maple trees and a second age class of sugar maple and yellow birch. Well, what about uneven age stands? What do they have as diameter distributions, and do they differ? Here's one that came from a stand in central New York, northern hardwoods. Classic reverse J structure shown by the dashed line, and the actual condition shown by the solid line. So this stand has a reverse J type of distribution, not regular, some deficiencies, some excesses, but it's generally reverse J. What about this one? This is another northern hardwood stand, not too far from the other one. It uses that left-hand tail, probably because this stand had not had any kind of management for 40 or 50 years prior to the time we did the inventory. And here's another one. This one had a partial cutting a few years, say 10 or 15 or 20 years prior to on the inventory. And you see that high left-hand tail result of some regeneration that occurred with the last entry, but not smooth reverse J, but still having that reverse J type of shape. So if you look at different alternative structures, the two here in dark color, the upper right and the lower center, those are ones that cause great uncertainty. If we just look at the diameter distribution and try to decide if those are even or uneven age. Well, do we have any other clues that might trigger better thoughts about the age range, such as that even age stand in the lower diagram and the uneven age one in the upper right-hand diagram? Consider the vertical structure. In uneven age stands, you have this kind of pattern in tree size by age class. These came from actually measured conditions by Laura Kenneth back in the 90s. So the old age class on the left has tallest, has a big crown. The next youngest age class is not quite as tall, has a big crown, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that there's a range of heights associated with the age classes, and the trees all have about a 40 to 60% live crown ratio. So that you get green foliage in a continuous layer from the top of the tallest tree down to the base of the shortest one. And it would look like this if we plotted those out in a diagram representing the stand. You see the vertical structure with trees of varying heights, all with fairly large live crown ratio, uneven age. There it is, the green wall. This is a managed uneven age stand under selection system. Short, medium, tall trees, vertical distribution of foliage. Now contrast that with even age northern hardwoods, unthinned. I don't have actual measurements here, but over the years I've taken classes to even age stands, and I always ask them to tell me what's the live crown ratio of trees in different crown positions. And they always come up with about these figures. The dominants have a 25 to 30% live crown ratio, unthinned now. The co-dominants about 20 to 25%. The intermediates about 15 to 20. And the overtop trees generally less than 15%. Now notice that the dominant, co-dominant, intermediate trees don't have a great difference in height. And if you put those together into a diagram for a stand, you'd have these three crown classes at a similar height with the overtop trees down below them. With an even age stand, the crown canopy starts close to the ground, and as the stand matures, that green leafy layer rises higher and higher and higher and higher above the ground, leaving the naked understory, as you see here in this northern hardwood stand with a mixture of sugar maple, white ash, and black cherry. So the degree of vertical structural diversity often gives us a good clue to the age arrangement. Uneven age on the left with the green wall, a variety of tree heights and foliage associated with it, even age stand being a leafy canopy that's essentially elevated well above the ground. You can see through these things long distances. A second way to look at them is at the bark characteristics, particularly of a small tree. On the left, a young tree, it has smooth bark. On the right, an old tree, but it has rough bark. It has bark that's more like that of mature trees. Notice in the background, the older tree, to the left of the one in the foreground, see the similarity of the bark characteristic. Here again, you see it. There's the young tree on the left. It has smooth bark. It has good form. It has good quality potentially. Look at the ones on the right. Those are gnarly trees with old bark characteristics and poor quality. So you can use both the vertical structure and the bark characteristics, particularly of the small trees within the stand, to help you sort out even from uneven age. And if you make a poor decision about the age arrangement, you will make a poor decision about the silviculture. And why? Because the diameter growth patterns differ appreciably, dramatically, extensively between even and uneven age stands. Let's start with the uneven age stands and review both the silviculture and look at the growth patterns in these uneven age stands with high degree of vertical structural characteristics. Remember something old? If you've dealt with selection system silviculture, you probably have come across the writings of Aaron Zilga from the Upper Lake States, who made the first trials with selection system silviculture in the hardwoods, and then in most community types of North America. And they recommended this residual structure that shows up as a dashed line on the diagram. They argue that you should create and maintain this distribution through repeated entries to a stand, and to do that by cutting across the size classes to balance the age classes, to create each time this distribution of something as close as you can to it. And then they set an upper diameter of 24 inches as financially mature. You can move that downward. You don't have to be fixed at 24 inches, but it's this type of structure. Portion trees across size classes, that's rather important. Here was their residual structure for a 10-year cutting cycle, 10, 20, 30, and 30 square feet of basal area. I remember it by 1, 2, 3, 3, total of 90 square feet for a 10-year cutting cycle. And when you cut, you try to get as close as you can to those residual basal areas amongst the size age classes. Now, when they actually did the cuttings, they went to a much lower residual basal area. It was about 55 square feet to the acre. And that's the lower dashed line on this diagram. With some work that Jerry Hansen and I did, we were able to put together through simulation some alternative structures that would be associated with 15, 20, and 25-year cutting cycles. And there's the green line associated with about 25 to 30-year cutting cycle. So for 15 years, we would say leave about 85 square feet. For 20 years, about 70. And for 25 years, about 65 square feet. I no longer recommend going to lower residual density with the longer cutting cycles. You just have fewer options in the future. So if you make some sort of a mistake, it's going to trap you with those lower densities. The key factor here You want to maintain similar proportions of basal area across the size or age classes, similar to what Aaron Zilgett originally proposed for northern hardwood. I would argue that probably this concept applies to other forest community types as well, where you get uneven age stand, where you get uneven age stand. So you go into the stand, and here's the diagram on the right, which shows the actual diameter distribution prior to any sort of entry. It's a solid line, and the dashed line is that Aaron Zilgett structure, was later presented by Arbogast as a management guide, and you try to decide what you cut, remove the excesses, and what you're going to do about compensating for those deficiencies within some of the size. Here's the actual cut in that stand. Let's go back. Here's what we found prior to cutting. There's the actual residual. So it's mimicking the Arbogast Aaron Zilgett structure across the diameter distribution, but at lower residual density. We were going to a longer cutting cycle, something more like 15 to 20 years. And so we reduced the stocking across the structure, but tried to get as close as we could to the proportions represented in the Aaron Zilgett distribution. But then what happens? How's that stand grow and develop? What can we recall from the past? Well, let's go back to Aaron Zilgett. You remember this diagram from their bulletin 1076, 1953? They showed a series of stands cut to different residual densities. So the A line is about 70 square feet residual. And as you go to B, C, D, and E, you get higher and higher levels of residual stocking. E line is actually an old growth stand with about 135 square feet per acre. So look at the growth pattern. As you go from the high density to the low density stand, the growth changes, increases, and most dramatically in the small size classes. And as you cut across the size classes, as you go to lower and lower residual densities within the acceptable range, it will have a profound effect on the growth of the small trees. The big trees grow better after cutting, but the small trees, you see the biggest change. Well, is there anything more recent that supports this notion, particularly among northern hardwoods? Back in 2008, Diane Kiernan took data from selection system stands here in New York State and evaluated diameter growth. So the vertical axis on this diagram is a change in diameter, and the horizontal axis is tree diameter, and this is representing a 15-year change in tree diameter for stands cut to 65, 75, 85, and 95 square feet. And look which trees grow the better. Small trees have great growth potential. Small trees grow better than large ones in uneven age stand. That doesn't mean we don't get reasonable growth out of bigger trees, but the small trees have this growth potential, which can be, you can draw out by cutting to a balanced structure and reducing the residual density. For comparison with Aaron Zilgett, I extrapolated to 135 square feet. Now that's the maximum basal area we used to find in old growth stands when we had them. And look what happens, that as you reduce residual stocking, you get a great growth response. Management does make a difference in the rate that trees grow. And I've now gone back to 2 inches. The previous diagram stopped at 6 inches because that's where Aaron Zilgett did. And now I've extended it to the lower size classes, and it shows us that the peak diameter growth occurs really in the fall class, somewhere around 8 or 9 inches in diameter. Small trees are better than big ones. This modern data are quite consistent with what Aaron Zilgett found. Let's look at another aspect of selection system, and that is regenerating new trees. So some really new diagrams that came out of some work that Lindsay Nostrom did. The vertical axis shows the numbers of trees on a mill acre plot. So you take those numbers and multiply by 1,000 to get per acre value. Horizontal axis is the number of years since cutting. Now there's two sets of curves. The lower set of curves occur in stands where there's a high density of understory beech. Those beech subcanopies that we're seeing more and more common across northern hardwood forests. When you have that beech subcanopy, you really don't regenerate much of anything from all other species. The upper curves are non-beech species where you have very low levels of beech interference. So the green bar shows the peak numbers for stands cut to 95 square feet, about 150 trees to the acre. And the blue bar shows the pattern for 65 square feet, about 200 trees to the acre, in 1 to 2 inch trees that are recruited to the stand structure. Now there's another dimension to this, and this comes from the work that Pablo Donoso did. He looked at new sugar maple trees that had been recruited to the stand after a period of time from selection system. If those trees had pre-existed the cutting and had lived less than 67% of their life in a managed condition, it took 34 years for them to reach 1 year. They don't grow very rapidly. If they grew for 67% to 80% roughly of their life in a managed condition, it only took 30 years. And if at least 80% of their life those trees grew in a managed environment, it took only 26 years. So in a managed stand, we're going to take more than a cutting cycle to get trees from the time they regenerate into the time when they're at least 1 inch in diameter. But management makes a difference. Under management, where you cut across the size classes, you can speed up or shorten that time to get trees to that 1 inch class. So back to growth. Here's the diagram for a stand cut to 75 square feet. Small trees grow better than the big trees. And you see on the right that 6 inch tree will grow about 1.9, nearly 2 inches in 6 years. A 24 inch tree, only about 8/10 of an inch. Now these numbers are averages. And not all trees grow at a common diameter. They don't grow at the same rate, as we usually portray with growth equations. So when you see a regression line like this, it represents an average. But in fact, some trees grow better than the average and others grow less than the average. And we can represent that by kind of a series of curves, zones here. Above the dark blue line are 4 zones representing trees that grew the rate of the average plus 2, plus 3, plus 4. And the same, there are negative. Some trees grow less than the average, -1, -2, -3, -4. So there are trees of a common starting diameter that grow at different rates. And statistically, you can accommodate that within modeling if you want to. In the good old days, remember the movement percents? Where we developed from the measurement data information about the differences in the rates that trees grow, ones that started off in the same size class. Kenneth Davis presented this diagram to illustrate the problem. Now, the green arrow marks the 14.1 inch size class. These 14.1 inches. There are 5 trees that measured 14.1 inches. The diagonal lines here represent trees that in the lower left stayed in the 14 inch class, grew up to the 15 inch class, to the 16 inch class, and to the 17 inch class. And you see that the trees are distributed along that vertical line. One of them stayed 14 inches. One of them went up to the 15 inch class, 3 went to the 16 inch class, etc. So that we can then represent that as proportions of trees that started off in the class. 20% stay the same, 20% go up 1 class, 20 or 60% go up 2 classes. And that's what you see here in this chart. These are movement percents based on the growth, measured growth of trees of different sizes and ages in selection system stands, uneven age northern hardwood. Now, what's important here? If we're marking that stand, when we mark that stand, we want to keep the trees that are enclosed within this orange bracket. Don't worry about the ones to the left of the orange bracket. Those are trees of low vigor. They're not going to grow as well as the ones on the right-hand side. of the chart. Those are the trees with bigger, better crowns, with signs of good, vigorous bark. So when you make your marking, you keep the trees that are in the right-hand side of this diagram and cut the ones on the left. You'll leave the best of each age class, both from potential growth rate based on those characteristics and also for quality. That's selection system. Well, can we reflect these changes or how these stands would change based on remeasurements of stands? Let's go back to the original one. Here's that 71 square foot residual back in 1973, paralleling the Arbogast line, but a little bit lower than. Upper right, 11 years later, we're getting excesses. We're seeing trees moving across the diameter distribution, moving to the right as they get bigger. Lower left is what happened after 15 years and showing the excesses and the bumps above the line crosshatch. The lower right shows the basal area figures. The trees of small sizes grew well, moved up through the size classes to ensure to maintain this diameter distribution. But notice on the left-hand end, the solid line is bigger than what we started out with. And it's a new age class. So here's the actual change. This is 1973 on the left. It changed to, by 1991, to what you see on the right. Filled in, smoothed out, added tree to the left-hand tail. And there's that left-hand tail, which includes a upgrowth of trees that were small in size, less than an inch, less 1 inch to 2 inches, plus the advanced regeneration that became established 25 to 30 years ago. Here's the second cycle. So in 1994, we cut the stand a second time. You see the residual stand. We're able to get it right, almost close to Arbogast, but at a low residual stocking, as we had planned. By 2009, it had grown well. The deficiencies and the bumps had essentially attenuated, smoothed out. So by 2009, the end of the second cutting cycle, we've got almost a perfect Arbogast diamond distribution. And on the right now is the post-cutting stand. What's more, we're reducing it below the Arbogast level because we wanted to use something more than 10-year cutting cycle. Notice that I did not cut trees on the very left-hand side. We know from past experience that trees less than about 5 inches, we're going to lose 15 to 20% of those logging damage. So I didn't mark any of those trees. Now, selection system then is sustainable. We get good growth across the size classes. We have regeneration to fill in the lower end of the tail, as you see here in the stand dominated by sugar cane. Uneven age then, good growth across all sizes. But what about even age communities? Here's a diameter distribution for a 70 to 75-year-old even age northern hardwood stand up at the Ranger School property in Wanakina. Picture of it on the right. Mostly sugar maple with components of white ash and black cherry. As with all even age stands, we begin to see early on this tight canopy forming. By 10 years, we have a closed canopy, 10 to 15 years. The stand gets a little older, we begin to see a differentiation in heights among trees of the same species and between species. And we see differential growth rates in diameters as well. So that after 25 to 40 years, somewhere in that range, there's a distinct stratification of diameters and heights within these communities. So you can clearly see dominant, codominant, intermediate, and overtop trees of different sizes of the same age. And giving us this kind of diameter distribution by 70 to 75 years ago. If you go back to the Growth and Yield book by Osman, translated from German, he put in this diagram and is arguing here that the growth of a tree is a function of the environmental conditions, the climate, the soil, but also the crown position. But he goes beyond that in saying that the environmental conditions, represented here by soil and climate, interact with the genetic potential of the tree to influence the growth rates in height and thus the crown position of the tree, so that the inherent genetic capacity of the tree, how well it's suited to the environmental conditions at a site, will determine the long-term growth pattern and where it ends up in different crown classes. He also presented this diagram. The vertical axis shows growth. In this case, it's cubic meters of wood. The horizontal axis is the amount of crown area, the size of the crown. And then each of those lines represents trees at different crown positions. The dominants are the ones, the codominants the twos, the threes are the intermediates, the four is the overtop. What does it show us? It shows us that the dominant trees with the biggest crowns produce the most. And as you go down through the crown classes, you get less and less and less growth and volume production after treatment. Said another way, once a run, always run. Just like pigs, the litter of pigs. You eat the small one for Thanksgiving dinner, and then grow the rest for sale to the market. Back in the 80s, John LaRue went up to the thinning plots at Ranger School and measured the growth, the 9-year growth, and he found this pattern here. Now I've marked the codominant trees with blue and the overtop with purple. The intermediates are in the middle. We didn't have enough dominant trees to really model in this case. What does that pattern show? Trees of upper canopy positions grow the best. The big trees grow better than the small trees. He also, when he tested the regressions using tree diameter and then added crown position, he found crown position was redundant with tree diameter. So it showed us that if you look at the tree diameter in even age stands, you can do a pretty good job in forecasting how well it will grow into the future after thinning. We've come back to that stand and others since then, and here is the more current diameter growth taken after a period of about 25 years, but I'm only representing a 15-year period of change here. Again, diameter change is on the vertical axis and tree diameter on the horizontal axis. This is for stands thin with 60% relative density, our target. The small trees do not grow well. The bigger the tree, the better the growth. In even age stands 4 to 4.5 thin. Another representation of it, this is the longer-term pattern of growth for a 12-inch sugar maple tree at different residual densities. This is relative density. So after thinning, the years is on the horizontal axis and the change in diameter on the vertical. Notice 100% and 80% line are dramatically less going than the 60 or 45%. We would normally thin stands with 60% relative density, let them grow up to 80%, and then thin them again. So you can apply or infer from this diagram that as you go from 60 to 80%, the growth is going to slow because of the increased crowding as the canopy fills in. Here is a growth period for 24 years, again, change in diameter on the vertical axis. And now I've broken it down by trees of different sizes. You can see the effect of tree size on growth. The bottom line is an 8-inch tree and the top line is a 20-inch tree. The larger the tree, the better the crown position, the better the growth. So you keep the trees of upper canopy positions, optimize the growth, and you release their crowns by cutting smaller trees around. Notice here too that as time passes, the difference in the rates of growth between small and large trees becomes greater and greater and greater. So that there's a much greater spread in differences in growth at 24 years after thinning than there was at 4 years after thinning. small trees grow better after thinning, but never grow as well as big trees. And even need stand. Once a run, always a run. Here we are, two trees from the same stand at 55 to 60 years of age. A big tree on the left, upper canopy position, tree on the right, probably a co-dominant. And again, the growth rates. In this case, a 4-inch tree would grow about 1.75 inches in a 15-year period. A 20-inch tree would grow about 2.5 inches. In thinning, in dealing with even age stands, you need to keep the big trees by cutting small ones around them when you do the thinning. You can see it in the movement percents again, same thing. And here once more, the key message is that when you do your thinning, you keep the trees inside the orange circle and don't focus your future onto those outside the orange circle. Pick the trees with the best crowns, the best signs of vigor. Those should be your residual. Well, let's see how this plays out in actual change within the stand, starting with this diameter distribution again. Do crown thinning, it'll look like this. So we went from this condition before thinning to this condition after it, and this diameter distribution before thinning, and this diameter distribution after thinning. Remember crown thinnings, what they look like? Let's use this as a representation of an even-aged northern hardwood stand. And if we do a crown thinning, we're going to cut those cross-hatched trees to free the crowns of the best we have within the upper canopy layer. We're not going to worry about the understory. We're going to work in the main crown canopy layer, favoring the best trees. It'll end up looking like this. So here's the change. In this case, we actually see a growth of small trees, but look at how much the upper trees have grown, extended direct. We're actually now into something that's beginning to look more like that tail and a potbelly that we saw earlier. Here's the stand after 35 years, actual growth. There's the tail of the potbelly. Notice the great influx of trees on the lower end of the diameter distribution. That's slow upgrowth of old trees, but there's some new cohort that regenerated in the stand. We didn't think it would happen, but when we cut these 70 to 75-year-old stands to 60% relative density, if there's a seed source there, and there will be, and there's no interference, and there's really low levels of browsing, we get a regeneration response within these stands. We have some millacre plots that follow and track the regeneration, and this is the purple line showing the data off those regeneration plots. So the purple line represents the new cohort, and the difference between that and the other line, the black line, in the small sizes is the persistence of small trees and their slow growth flow. So we have in these even age stands a new cohort formed on the left, slow growing trees of small sizes left behind in the understory, and a movement of trees of the upper canopies into larger sizes. This is what it actually looks like. There's the upper canopy tree, the uniform spacing, and the runts plus the new cohort. Now, as an aside, if you were thinking about the stand being uneven age and tried to treat it like an uneven age stand, the upper canopy tree, the large diameter trees above 12 inches and more would look like it's pretty good. And so would the small trees because of the slow growth of the runts and the additions of new cohort. But those 5 to 12 inch classes don't match the arbogast structure. And as we saw in the actual progression of change through time, we're forming this tail and potbelly. This is not a sustainable structure. At some point, those large trees will get to the point where you'll want to cut them because they're mature, and then you won't have a great stand left behind. Perhaps moving to this kind of distribution. So you could say, well, you cut the big ones and you have a new age class started. But that left-hand tail is a combination of some new regeneration and runts that are slowly growing but left behind. Even-aged northern hardwoods, dominated by sugar maple, 35 years after crown thinning. Well, let's jump to a common example from northeastern North America and focus on the even-age stands because I believe, and I've tried to illustrate that if you cut the big trees out of even-age stands, there's some real consequences to that. But as we look at thousands of acres and millions of acres, perhaps, of even-age stands, we see mere cutting going on. We've all heard this. I remember hearing this right after I got on college. Cut the big trees and let the little trees grow. That's defined as selective cutting by SAF standards. This is the SAF definition in 1971. Selective cutting, creeping, culling, high grading, and exploitive cutting that removes only trees of certain species or size. Look at the bottom line. No known silvicultural requirements and sustained yield being wholly or largely ignored. Growth differences between even and uneven age stands being ignored. You just go ahead and cut the big trees. Unfortunately, when SAF put the new dictionary out in 1998, they gentrified or simplified this, saying selective cutting means removing only a portion of the stand, not to be confused with selection method. You should have said selection system. To me, it's so generalized, this is not specific enough to mean much of anything anymore. But it includes diameter limit cutting in even age stands. That's uncontrollable and unpredictable what happens into the future. Now, in the literature about thinning, you find selection thinning defined. It's a bad name, but we have it. Selection thinning means you remove the trees of the dominant crown class, the larger diameter trees, to favor ones of lower crown classes, to favor trees that don't grow as well, what it really means. Well, let's look at it. Let's see what happens. Back to this diagram again. If I'm doing a selection thinning, a diameter limit cutting, I'm going to take out the crosshatch trees. It'll be the ones of good growth that you see here. I'm going to cut those. I'll leave the runts behind. They'll grow poorly. You'll end up with this kind of stand. It tends to be, these diameter limit cuts tend to be patchy in the distribution of residual stands as well as poor growing trees. Here's two examples, actual examples of taking the big trees out of even age stand. Irregular, patchy, not very exciting to look at. I wouldn't want to own that. Well, we do know that the small trees will grow and the crowns will get a little bit bigger. They grow slowly, but they do get bigger. You end up with something like this, so you do another cutting, and here's what you get. And what we've seen across large, vast areas of the Northeast is that by the time you come for a third entry, there's really not enough volume to sustain an optimal cut. You've really done yourself in. Well, what happens to the diameter distribution if you do this kind of strategy, use this kind of strategy? So let's go back to that pre-cut stand again. This was the one we illustrated earlier using crown thinning. And we're going to cut everything to the right-hand side of that red line and end up with the diameter distribution on the right. And let it grow for a 15-year period. You begin to see the left-hand tail in the pot belly. But instead of having trees moving on towards that 21, 22 inch size class, we maybe get some 16 inches out there. We're gonna cut it again at that time. And here's the end of the second cutting cycle. This is 30 years later. You see the distinct left-hand tail in the pot belly. Again, not very big trees on the upper end. Slow growing trees. Each time you enter, you're taking out the biggest, you're leaving behind the slowest growing of the residual trees. That's an actual case where two diameter limit cuts were applied to an even age northern hardwood stand. Unfortunately, it was a gorgeous stand to start with. So, left-hand diagram, 35 years after crown thinning. Right-hand diagram, 30 years after selection. Quite a difference. Silviculture does make a difference. Back to some philosophy. Silviculture. That's the way we sustain essential ecologic and economic outcomes that are important to a landowner's interest. Without it, you're merely extracting timber, cutting trees. With silviculture, we should get a predictable outcome. Hopefully we do. And that does happen with selection system in uneven age stands and crown thinning in even age stands. You could argue that pre-thinning and thinning below you can get predictable results. Even uneven age growth is not the same. Uneven age to the left, even age to the right. The big differences in the growth of small trees. In uneven age stands, the small trees grow well. They have a promise for the future. In even age stands, the small trees are runts. They will not grow well for the future. So if you leave the small trees and cut the big trees, you're creating a stand that will produce less, develop less, grow less, have less quality. So what you do, the decisions you make about the age arrangement and the kind of silviculture you apply does make a difference, including structural stability and including productive capacity. Critical, silviculture must fit the age arrangement in the stand. If you understand the growth, that's the key to effective silviculture. But to understand the age arrangement means to understand the growth potential. Focus on the age arrangement, get it right, you should do well. Peter, that's all I have.
Great. Again, Ralph, thank you very much. So this is a chance when you all have an opportunity to type in questions for Dr. Nyland. And I'll start, although I should probably know the answer to this. I'm thinking about the growth curves in the uneven age system, and the vertical axis was diameter change.
Did I end up not sharing? I did something.
You stop sharing. That's okay.
Okay.
That's fine. So I'm assuming now you can see the chat window.
I have to figure which button to push here. There it goes. Okay, thank you.
Yep. So if you all have questions, go ahead and type them in, please. And I'm thinking about the growth curves for the uneven aged stand that you depicted.
Yes.
And maybe that was Kieran's work. What in the vertical axis was diameter increment. Those curves would look different. And you talk about the significantly faster diameter growth in the kind of the mid diameters, the pole size trees. If you were looking at basal area increment, would you have the same pattern, or would it?
Well, you'd get it probably would flatten out because you get a small change in diameter in a big tree gives you a lot of basal area volume, right?
Right.
Because it's a function of the square of the diameter.
Right.
So the curves would probably flatten out or become more horizontal, yes.
Right. So is there, I mean, if you're trying to grow, the only reason why I bring that up is because I've heard people try to argue that, the notion of cutting the big trees is because they're growing slower than the small.
Yeah, the old growth percent kind of thing that
right.
has been argued. Well, part of the problem with that, if you've got to maintain this balanced structure to get a consistent flow of yields out of the stand in uneven age stand.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you've got to have enough stocking to keep the growth up. If you do a diameter limit cut, which happens in uneven age stands as well, you end up with a lot of crowding in the small size classes.
Mm-hmm.
That negatively affects the growth.
Sure. And the the people that are making the kind of the lower percentage growth argument are not really interested in continuous or sustained yield from that stand. They're interested in a single yield from that stand.
Well, I think that's right. Often these arguments come from what will happen in the short run rather than the long run.
Right. They're just trying to find a way to make their justification seem reasoned.
You said it, I didn't.
So, all right. So we have a question from Eric. Oh, let's say, okay. So
Okay.
yep. So before Eric, there was Peggy Sanders.
Oh, where's Peggy? How does one know when? Oh, I guess you could look at that from a variety of perspectives. One is the financial aspect of it, and if you here you would look at the value increment in a tree, how much volume it adds, and what the value of that volume is. And as a landowner, you would have a required rate of return. In tree growth, you can't get much above 5%. Somewhere between 3.5% and 5% is reasonable. So let's say you chose 5% as the required rate of return. You'd grow a tree until leaving it for one more cutting cycle would not give you a 5% return. And then you would cut it. And you generally apply that across the age class, the size classes. So generally you hear people talk about trees being financially mature at 20 inches or 24 inches. And that should be based upon a calculation where you look at the change in value and whether that change in value gives you a rate of return that you're satisfied with. So people who have a commercial interest would usually have a higher rate of return than someone who has a product commodity production as a kind of a secondary or multiple use values, so they would maybe accept a lower rate of return. Now, leaving trees to large sizes may have other values too. In many wildlife habitat studies that people do, there are key values in having trees of large diameters in the stand as an important component of habitat. So if you had an important wildlife objective for your property, you might forget the financial maturity guide to some degree and say, well, I need to keep at least some 20 and 25 and 30-inch trees even to satisfy that wildlife component. We have actually evidence from studies that Heather Ruth did under the guidance of Gregory McGee, where she looked at the composition of lichens in the upper canopy of large sugar maple trees in the Adirondacks and found that those large trees have a unique community of lichens that they take a long time to grow and develop. So if you only have a small tree, you're not going to have that lichen component as diverse. So if your concern is the biological diversity, there's a reason to keep some large trees. You don't keep all of them, but to keep some of them for habitat, for diversity, or whatever, for visual qualities. So you can set your maximum diameter on a variety of things, but in a commodity production environment, it would be based on the point where the value growth of a tree drops below what you require as rate of return for growing it for another cutting cycle. And that implies that you have a use for that money, and you will take the money from the tree and reinvest it and get that alternate rate out of your investment in something other than growing the tree. I hope that speaks to the question.
It does, and I'm not sure of Peggy's background, but for others who may be on the webinar, I'm presuming that you're not trying to give I know you're not trying to give the impression that you go out and make an individual decision on a tree and say, okay, this is a big tree and therefore I cut it. It's essentially a matter of cutting the big trees. And as you said, you're looking at a cutting cycle and you would develop a prescription that would be applied to the entire stand.
That's right, based on the average growth of trees in those larger sizes. And that applies to uneven age stands.
Mm-hmm.
Totally.
Right.
If you have even age stands, you look at when the value production for the whole stand drops below your required rate of return. So that you don't look at the big trees and say they're financially mature. The whole stand becomes financially mature. And then you apply an even age regeneration method to replace it with the younger stand that will grow through time at the required rate of return. It's a huge difference between even and uneven age stands. Uneven age stands, you make that judgment for an age class. Even age stands, you make that judgment for the stand as a whole. And often people don't do that. They rationalize the pecking away of large trees from even age stands by saying those trees are financially mature and the others are not. That's not true. The others just aren't growing very well. Okay. That's all I want to say.
Yeah.
That's a good question, Peggy.
Yes. On to Eric's question.
All right. Based on bark, what is the upper? Well, I think in an uneven age stand, you just look at whatever trees you have there, and you should see distinct difference in the bark characteristics between the young trees and the old trees, which would be the small trees and large trees. In an even age stand, the same thing happens. You will see, you look at the small trees and the large trees, and you will see that old bark characteristic in the small trees as well as the old trees. The small trees, in a vigorous tree of dominant position with sugar maple, for example, and even age stand, you see the bark curling. You get that orangish color at the base of that curl. But in the younger trees, you just won't see that. The bark won't be curling. It'll be very tight, but it'll look like an old tree. I hope that speaks to your question, Eric. What else we got? I guess that's it.
That's it. So we didn't, Eric. So the Peggy's question was just sent to you and I, Ralph. So the question when we were talking about when to cut a tree, the question was, how does one know when to cut a big tree? So
yeah, you do it when it's financially mature or has reached the size that satisfies your management objectives.
Okay, Eric has another question for you.
Yeah, when you said you keep the faster growing saw timber uneven. I really meant to say you keep the faster growing trees of large diameters in the even age stand. I don't mean that you cut all the big trees because they're growing smaller or less than the small trees in the uneven age stand, but I was trying to emphasize that there's a huge difference in the growth potential of big and small trees within even versus uneven age stands. And in uneven age stands, those small trees have huge growth potential. In even age stands, they don't. They don't. So in the case of uneven age stands, I guess I would not look at the bark condition as much as the rates of growth, volume growth, and the rates of value growth, and when the tree has reached the point where it satisfied the financial objectives for commodity production or serves other, is gone past its usefulness for the non-commodity goals.
All right. I think that's all the questions, Dr. Nyland. I'd like to thank you again and thank the participants. This was another wonderful presentation, some really good questions. So I appreciate that. And next month, we're going to be a week early. So the third Wednesday is the day before Thanksgiving. So we're going to move it a week earlier, and we'll be joined by Kevin Dodds, an entomologist with the Forest Service, who's going to be talking about southern pine beetle in New York and some work he's done with that. So thank you all again. Have a great evening and enjoy the start of fall weather. Have a good night.